So, have you heard about the final rule? I mean, there's lots of final rules. Obviously, I'm talking about firearms and the ATF. This is Alan with Quarter Horse Arms. And in this podcast, I kind of want to talk about the ATF's final rule pertaining to receivers and, things like 80%ers. There were a couple of things that kicked in, and most of this began, or hit heavily, I think by October or September of last year. And one of the things that, the ATF was doing was attempting to close a loophole with 80%ers. And as many of you know, an 80%er is, a lump of metal. And it has pretty much everything except the trigger machined out and drilled out for things like the hammer. So what the ATF was attempting to do is make a statement that said if it looks like a gun or can be readily converted into a gun, it is a gun. Now, when they say readily converted, they didn't really talk about how much time's involved. You could go out and buy a ghost gunner and have the thing milled out, in a couple hours. The other thing they were attempting to do was get rid of ghost guns, meaning personally made firearms. Stuff that you did by yourself that didn't involve a FFL or a manufacturing FFL. The rationale for that was, and this was given in the ATF podcast, was somewhere in the realm of 450 crimes were committed with ghost guns, and they were only able to trace something like between 20 and 30 of them. Now, on the one hand, you could say, yeah, we should find out who committed the crime. On the other hand, if you got the weapon and you got the person that committed the crime, where the gun came from, to me, would be irrelevant. And given the amount of crimes involving weapons every year, 400 to 500 that you can't identify, to me, is a drop in the bucket. So, again, where did the ATF come back with all this? Well, after some of the mass shootings, the president instructed the ATF to come up with a way to do this. Well, this is what they came up with. And, it was even more, or I guess it even had a greater impact on people, because if you brought your ghost gun in someplace for repair and it had to spend the night, you couldn't get it back without having a serial number put on it. And now you're going to trust my hand carving numbers into your gun and, potentially ruining it. But that's neither here nor there. There were ways around that. Now, I think in the past week, so we're now in the end of March or middle of March in 2023, and a federal judge, so I'm assuming it was, a Circuit Court of Appeals, granted an injunction against those regulations. And the injunction went into effect right away, which means theoretically you could go and continue buying your 80%ers. And unfortunately, for some of the companies that were shut down or had stuff confiscated, the question is whether or not they'll get that stuff back, whether or not that company or companies can stay in business. I mean, they suffered a huge loss. And even if it wasn't a giant loss, I mean, you're dealing with companies where, you're making a few bucks here and there selling stuff, and suddenly you lose your stock. Now, where did the injunction come from? Well, obviously some guy wasn't happy with it. There were a lot of people that weren't happy with it. And as a gun dealer, the only thing I could tell you is that with that final ruling, it meant that anytime you bought an 80%er, it had to be serialized, which meant potentially for me, I could make more money because prior to that, you wanted an 80%er, you could have it shipped right to your house because it wasn't a gun. So with the injunction, the challenge was to their final ruling was, is this something that the ATF can do? Meaning, can the ATF, who's essentially, to me, a regulatory agency, can they pass laws and regulations? On my end of the thing, looking at it going, no. I mean, laws belong to Congress. And if Congress wanted to close that loophole, it seems to me they could pass a law to do it. And instead, what the ATF did was, with their final ruling and going after some of the businesses, they criminalized and demonized these people who were, prior to everything, following the letter of the law. So now the important thing is going to be, what's the next step? Because what the ATF did was at least kind of ignore the Gun Control Act. I mean, a gun is a gun, but as far as everyone else was concerned, the 80%ers were lumps of metal. And at the end of the final ruling, the ATF said, hey, if you really start with a lump of metal, it's not a gun. Unfortunately, they did it to a whole bunch of other stuff. And it had a huge impact. And I've brought this up in a previous podcast, is should the ATF be making those regulations without any kind of oversight? So if you're going to make it a law, meaning if you showed up until this injunction went into effect and said, hey, Alan, I'd like this 80%er, and, I pull it out of my safe, because that's where I keep everything so I don't lose it. So I hand it to the guy and sell it. I just committed a felony if I didn't have it serialized. So what they've in effect done is go beyond regulatory stuff, and they started passing laws and could throw my butt in jail. And they've already done some of that with people owning certain weapons they shouldn't have, that can go multiple bangs with one pull of the trigger. But those were clearly outlined in the Gun Control Act. So those things were all registered, and the laws were very clear about it. But now what they were doing was, all right, hey, President said, hey, let's close some loopholes. So they did. But the fact that they did doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it legal. And in my previous podcast about this, when they passed that final ruling, was, all right, here's how we got to deal with it. Here's how you can get around it if you need your gun fixed. And at least somebody had a lot more money than me and decided to bring a lawsuit, went to a federal court in Texas, and the judge says, yeah, this is kind of stupid. So we now have an injunction, and you can go back and do their stuff. So the question now is, will the ATF challenge it? And, maybe even a better question is, will somebody challenge, or will groups like the NRA, NSSF, all of the other 2A rights groups, put together a lawsuit against the government that will effectively bar the ATF from passing laws? And I think maybe this is the beginning. So hopefully some good will come of this. I mean, I'm pretty sure the ATF isn't going to be happy. The reality is not that many crimes were being committed with ghost guns. And frankly, a lot of people, like taking a 80%er and making their own gun. And in fact, I'll use this example. When I had a ATF inspection, the inspector said it was a wonderful thing that everyone should know how to make a gun. And, it kind of floored me because I kind of figured the ATF wouldn't do that. I mean, you'd kind of think that they wouldn't want guns going around. On the other hand, it made sense. So, at least as far as this injunction goes, and I honestly don't know how fast it's going to be challenged, is you can now get your lumps of metal and go back to making your ghost guns. For now. So who knows what's going to happen in the upcoming weeks. But, we'll find out, and I'll try and keep you apprised. Okay, so I'm glad you guys are listening to my podcast. I look forward to hearing about comments, questions, ideas. You can call or text to 919-808-6480. You can email to info@quarterhorsearms.com. Feel free to check out our website at quarterhorsearms.com. And as always, I'm Alan with Quarter Horse Arms in Snow Camp, North Carolina. You guys have a great day and be safe out there.